All right, this is the last part of our lecture here, and we're thinking about how the contributions of these theorists have had an influence on the way that social theory is done today. I think it's always important to ask, why is it that we're thinking about these classical theorists? It's not often the case when you study a discipline that you go back to these early founding fathers of the discipline. But in sociology, we have a strong preoccupation with some of these early theorists, and almost all sociologists have read something from them, know something about them, and so on. And why is that? I think it's because they've had a tremendous impact on the way that the discipline has developed over time. We're kind of lucky in sociology that we are a very young discipline. Sociology as a concept has only been around for 150 years or so. And what that means is that it's very easy for us to go back to the beginning and see how our main ideas have developed. And I think it's also important to know that Marx, Weber, and Durkheim do have strong insights within them that can continue to be very influential on how we might think about the social world. I would say more generally it's about the kinds of questions they asked, the kind of approaches they took when analyzing the social world. That's what we've learned from these theorists. And that's where they've been really influential on scholars today. If you want to understand why sociologists care about the things they do, you can find the answers to that when you look back at some of these classical theorists. Does that mean everyone agrees with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim? No, obviously not. There have been decades of critique and engagement with these scholars. Many of their conclusions, Marx's conclusions about economic conclusions about capitalism, Durkheim's ideas about suicide, some of Weber's ideas on Protestantism. A lot of these ideas have been challenged, rejected. We've had new data, new theories, and that's a good thing. It's good to know that we're developing as a discipline. But I think we can still look back at these early theorists and learn something from the way they approach the social world, and that's what inspires scholars today. If a scholar calls himself a Marxist, it might not be that they agree with everything that Marx wrote or predicted, but that they like his general orientation towards the world. They believe in the analysis of class, they believe in the kind of critical component to Marx's thought and the sense that sociology should contribute to social change, these kind of things. Okay, so even though we might leave part of the classical theorists behind, sociologists continue to be inspired by the general approaches which are evident in their work and in their theories. Let me give you some examples of this. So last week, Steve talked briefly about the idea that we can separate theories into conflict perspective, functionalist perspectives, and interactionist perspectives. And I want to show you how these early theorists have influenced the development of these perspectives. So Marx is always seen as the quintessential example of a theorist who influenced the development of the conflict perspective in sociology. What is the conflict perspective? Well, conflict theorists analyze social phenomena by thinking about how those phenomena benefit certain groups, or how they maintain systems of power and inequality in the world. So if you ask a conflict theorist, why did marriage emerge as a human institution? Why do people get married? Typically they'll say, well, somebody must be benefiting here. It must be because of some relationships of power. Maybe it's about gender power, the power of men over women. Maybe it's about economic power. Maybe it's how certain individuals are able to monopolize power by chains of marriage in different societies. Those kind of things. They're always looking at power, inequality, authority, those kind of topics. Okay. Now, Marx was obviously focused on class conflict, and that's been highly influential. There are still many social theorists today who focus on class and class conflict. But what's important is that other forms of conflict theory have also emerged, and many of them have been inspired by Marx's approach. They take Marx's idea that there are two major classes who fight one another, and they transfer it into different kinds of social conflict. So many feminist theorists, for example, learned a lot from Marx, and they used a lot of Marx's tools to think about how men, as one class, dominate women as another class. Certain theorists of race, for example, contemporary critical race theorists, are often thinking about how social organizations benefit one race, typically white races, at the benefit of marginalized races. Queer theorists might think about how heterosexuals are able to institutionalize forms of culture and norms that devalue homosexual sexualities. Critical disability theorists might think about how able-bodied people and disabled people might have social conflicts, with the former group dominating the latter. And of course, increasingly today, there are theorists who are not just thinking about the world in terms of class, race, and gender as separate entities, but thinking about how all these different forms of inequality can intertwine and intersect. And I think not all of these theories have been explicitly influenced by Marx, but what they carry over from Marx is this strong focus on social conflict and a strong belief that when explaining human societies, you've got to look to conflict. You've got to ask the question of who benefits. I think that's the legacy of Marx in sociology. One example of this in contemporary theory, here I have a picture of Raymond Conlon, and you'll read about the work of Raymond Conlon next week. Raymond Conlon, like Marx, is very interested in developing conceptual tools that we can use as sociologists to understand how we perpetuate hierarchies of power. Conlon is famous for the idea of hegemonic masculinity, which you'll read about in the week on gender, and Conlon believed that there were all these ideas, superstructure, if you will, that helped maintain the dominance of men over women. Conlon also looks at how sociology itself might be set up in ways that benefit certain groups at the expense of others. And particularly she's interested in how the contributions of the Global South to sociology have been marginalized by the way that sociology is set up. And you'll hear about that more next week, and in particular her ideas of Southern theory. What about Durkheim? Durkheim has made some contributions to the study of social conflict, but he's typically seen as giving us an example of the functionalist perspective. Now remember that functionalist perspectives analyze social phenomena by asking, how do these phenomena work to fulfill the functional requirements of the society? They believe that society is like an organism, it has certain requirements, there has to be things in society that stop the society from collapsing or dying. And when they look at social phenomena, they're typically asking, how does that phenomena help to keep society stable? So think about how they would look at marriage, as opposed to the conflict theorists. If I ask the conflict theorists, why did human societies come up with this thing called marriage? It would be about power, gender power, class power, etc. If you ask the functionalists, why is it that almost every human society, human beings get married? That is a bit strange when you think about it, right? In almost every society we've ever studied, there is a concept of marriage. The functionalists would say maybe societies developed marriage because marriage is good for society in some ways. Maybe it provides a good environment for the rearing of children. Maybe it stops men from having conflict amongst one another over certain women. Maybe there are other kind of mechanisms, or maybe there are other things that marriage can do to keep society stable. They would ask those kind of questions. You can understand how the functionalist theorists and the conflict theorists might have some disagreements about a whole range of different social, political, ideological topics. Okay. Functionalist theorists are very popular in the early parts of the discipline. Herbert Spencer was a functionalist, Durkheim was a functionalist. But around about the middle of the 20th century, these ideas begin to fall out of fashion. There were many strong critiques made of functionalist theory. The most prominent one is that it's not actually all that easy to say that something is good or bad for society, because it's not an objective thing. If I look at an organism, it's quite easy to say when an organism dies, it's quite easy to say what's good for an organism or bad for an organism, at least on the level of health. But when it comes to a society, we all have deep disagreements about what is good for society. You and I might disagree on the kind of society we want to live in. Thus, it's very hard to look at a social phenomena and say, it's good for society. The question is, good for society according to who? According to what model of what society should be? Okay. So there were that's one problem with functionalism. There were many other issues as well. And so this idea of looking at societies like organisms and so on began to fall away around about the 40s and the 50s. Okay. Nonetheless, I would say that many sociologists remain interested in questions about function and dysfunction within specific institutions. And a lot of social analysis relies on some degree of functionalist perspective. You might say, you might be interested in marriage and the family. And you might be interested in what are the things which keep people together in relationships? What mechanisms function to work to have a happy, healthy relationship? Or you might be analyzing social policy. The government might be working to reduce poverty, either in its own country or in other countries around the world. And we might ask, what are the mechanisms which can be used to reduce poverty? What mechanisms can function to reduce poverty, create development, increase well-being, and so on? So there are possibilities to use functionalist analysis when looking at different institutions in a society, probably rather than looking at the society as a whole. I would also say that many sociologists remain interested in these Durkheimian questions about integration. What keeps society together? How do people hang together? Do we have problems today with not enough social integration, with a loss of social capital, with increasing anomie, something like that? Okay. A good example of this is in week 6 in the textbook. You'll read about Robert Balla and his theory of civil religion. So Balla was very much inspired by Durkheim, and like Durkheim, he was interested in how values work to bind people together, how communities needed some kind of shared value to bring them together, in the absence of which there would be disorder, chaos, anarchy, social conflict. And like Durkheim, Balla was interested in this idea of, well, we don't have a shared religion anymore. Most modern, liberal, plural, democratic societies, people have different religions. People might not have a religion at all. So what are the forms of values that we agree on? And he developed this idea of that we all have a shared belief in a civil religion. So regardless of our personal political disagreements, we might have a fundamental belief in democracy, or in, the idea that there should be a peaceful transfer of power, that government should govern according to a constitution. So Balla thought that we developed this shared common communal commitment to ideas like this, and that these things were really the only thing that remained to unite us as communities. Balla was also interested, like Durkheim, in individualization. And while Durkheim was a bit more positive about individualization, this growing uniqueness of personality in individuals, Balla thought that individualization could be a threat to the social order. And you'll read about this in kind of the coming weeks. Balla was a bit concerned that as people became more unique, as they started to lose any kind of shared culture, maybe this would drive polarization in society. And the end result of polarization might be social conflict. When we look at some societies around the world, you might ask yourself, do these people have anything in common anymore? There are such deep political disagreements in different societies. We might ask the question, with Durkheim, is there anything that holds them together anymore? And what problems might they cause if there's not? Right. Okay, lastly, we have Weber. Weber has influenced many different theoretical traditions. Many conflict theorists have used terms and ideas developed from Weber. That's important. But Weber has also had a very important influence on the interactionist perspective. Now, what is the interactionist perspective? You'll remember that the interactionist perspective is not often focused on big, large-scale social structures. They're more looking at how human beings behave with one another. They're looking at small-scale interactions between individuals and groups, and particularly how meaning works in interactions. How do people form their views of the social world? How do they form their interpretations of certain things in the social world? How do the meanings that they bring to social interaction shape the way that they interact with other people? And how might those meanings be challenged and reinforced through social interaction? Think about certain words, for instance. There's often social debate about certain words. Are they offensive? Should people say them or not, etc.? These are things which might be analyzed using an interactionist perspective. They might think about, what do certain words mean to certain groups of people? How do groups try to convince other groups about what certain words should mean, or whether it's okay to use certain words, for instance? These are something, again, which is negotiated in social interaction. And from these interactions stem these broader values that we have as a community. So interactionists are interested in action. They're interested in the point of view of the individual and how the meanings that they have, the way they interpret the world, changes the way they behave towards the world. And you can see this is something which they really get from the Weberian tradition. Weber said the same thing, that sociologists cannot use the tools of natural science. We've got to think about the individual, their point of view, their personal beliefs, and how their personal beliefs could shape their actions in the world. This has been really influential on the interactionist perspective, but also on the way that sociologists operate more generally speaking. Many sociologists today, rather than doing, say, big-scale surveys, they like that more intimate, small-scale interviews, long, in-depth interviews to understand people's point of view, focus groups to see how people have different understandings of certain social phenomena. All these methods come from Weber. They come from the interactionist perspective. Just as an example of how the interactionist perspective and how Weber's views have become influential, in week 10 you'll read about theorists like Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote a very famous 1990 book called Black Feminist Theory. And Collins was part of a theoretical movement called standpoint theory. And standpoint theory also pushed back against the very strong positivist notion of sociology, because they thought that attempts to be objective, to be scientific in sociology, to make big sweeping generalizations, often they concealed the fact that those generalizations were coming from a certain point of view, typically certain racial, class, and gender groups which dominated sociology at the time. So standpoint theorists argue that we've got to be very careful about our claims to objectivity And they argued that in particular when we're thinking about marginalization, inequality, and so on, we've got to put the perspective of marginalized groups at the forefront. To understand their point of view. How do they see domination? How do they understand the oppression that they face in the world? And so they would also use methods like interviews, focus groups, etc. And you can see how someone like Hill Collins combines elements of conflict theory and interactionism. She also wants to know how certain groups maintain power over others, but she's interested in the point of view of those over whom the power is maintained and what we can learn from understanding the way that they approach, see the world, see their own experience. Now, as I've said here, it can be useful to think about the general orientations of theorists, but don't take these categories, functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, don't think that they're universal, don't think we can put every theorist into one of these categories. These are just very broad perspectives or orientations that sociologists use when they try to understand the world. And one sociologist might try on different things. You might ask me that question about marriage. Why is it that people get married? I might say, how would a conflict theorist approach it? How would a functionalist? What would an interactionist say about these kinds of things? Think of them as different hats you can put on as a sociologist to try and test out different theories or hypotheses about the way the social world is. Today, it's more common that you'll see theorists who combine aspects of these various traditions. It's very rare that someone would say, just take from Marx, or just be a functionalist theorist. Typically, there'll be new and unique combinations of theories, because all these theories leave something out. And if we want to develop a sophisticated, holistic, nuanced understanding of the social world, then what we need is combinations of different perspectives and different ideas. Right? A good example of this is someone like Pierre Bourdieu. Now, you'll read about the work of Pierre Bourdieu in week 8. Bourdieu is a contemporary theorist of class, and so he's coming from the conflict perspective. He borrows heavily from Marx, but he also borrows heavily from Weber. He thinks that class is not just a matter of economic resources, but also a matter of status. So he's borrowing heavily from Weber and from Marx at the same time. There are also in Bourdieu very strong Durkheimian traits. Durkheim thinks so much of us as individuals is determined by our societies, and particularly by our class position. The kind of people we love, the kind of things we desire, the kind of foods we enjoy, the kind of holidays we go on, the things we find enjoyment in. Bourdieu thinks all of this is determined very much by our social position and by the values of the society around us. So you can see how bringing in Weberian, Marxist, Durkheimian perspectives, conflict theory, functionalism, interactionism, there's combinations that emerge which can analyze the social world in more sophisticated ways. And that's really where theory is at today. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Let me give you a brief recap. We've examined today the origins of sociology. Where did it come from? Why did it emerge as a discipline? And we've looked at some of the theories that were common in the very early days. Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Comte, Spencer, etc. I've said that sociologists remain interested in these theories, not necessarily because we all agree with Marx's analysis of capitalism, but because Marx gives us a way of looking at the world, as does Weber and Durkheim, that can be useful for developing new theories, for analysing what's going on. And you'll see traces of these older theories in all the theories that we look at throughout the course. In the coming weeks in the textbook, you'll see traces of Marxist, Weberian and Durkheimian thought. But remember, these are just three figures in a rich history of social thought, a history which I wanted to stress to you goes back to the very beginnings of human history. In learning social theory, in thinking about social theory, you engage with one of the most important traditions of thought in human civilization, something which goes back to the beginnings of human civilization. Okay? So remember, when we focus on Marx, Weber and Durkheim, we do gloss over all these other figures, the hundreds of other sociologists at the time who were doing interesting things. Okay? And I encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at some of these other figures as well. All right, there's a lot of content today, a lot of material, a lot of new concepts. I certainly understand that. Anything I've talked about in this lecture, any concept, enemy, the Protestant ethic, surplus value, whatever it is, there's an explanation in the textbook. There's definitions of these things in the glossary. So please feel free to have a look at that textbook, do the reading, think about some of the ideas that have come up in the lecture, have a look around on resources for other ideas on these concepts, And ask your tutors as well if you have any questions or concerns about the material. They can help clarify anything for you. Okay. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. Hope you've enjoyed this discussion of sociological theory. It's something that is my academic expertise. It's something I'm passionate about. It's something I really enjoy. Hopefully I've been able to convey some of that to you, and you've seen the utility and to a certain degree the beauty of social theory as well. Okay. Thank you. I'll see you all in week 4 for a discussion of globalization.